Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, with some more historic insights. And since last week's episode was about cryptids, or creatures who are rumored to exist, but whose existence is not acknowledged by science, I figured this week's episode should cover a similar theme, that is, the unexplained, and discuss the history of American UFO sightings. Because strange though it may seem, they are actually much older than one would figure. Most people probably think that UFO sightings only go back to about the 1950s, possibly the late 1940s. Not the case. So please join me as we dive into, or should I say, soar into, the history of American UFO sightings. Well, I should say going into some early UFO sightings. I can't cover them all, Lord knows, there'd be too many. This podcast would probably go over 19 hours, and I do not want to have to talk for 19 hours. Now, in modern popular culture, the term UFO, which stands for Unidentified Flying Object, usually refers to a suspected alien aircraft. However, its definition encompasses any unexplained aerial phenomenon. And actually, the term now most used by science is UAP, which stands for Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon. Many people believe that odd though it may seem, the first documented UFO sighting occurred in 1639 near present-day Boston, Massachusetts, and was recorded that same year by the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop. His journal entry dated March 1st gave a detailed account of the strange events that caused panic in the Puritans. Nothing like some nice alliteration. Winthrop related in his journal that a man named James Everell, whom he described as a sober, discreet man, was rowing in a boat with two other men in the muddy river, which emptied through a swamp into a tidal basin of the Charles River, when suddenly a great light came into view. According to the men, the light both hovered and then flew at high speed back and forth between their boat and the village of Charlestown 2 miles away. As Winthrop described it, when it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards square. When it ran, it contracted into the figure of a swine. It ran as swift as an arrow towards Charlton, and so up and down about 3 or 4 hours. Everell was captivated by the sight, and his companions watched the speeding light for several hours. Yet the strangest part of the story was about to happen. According to Winthrop's account, as the men watched the light event, they were come down in their boat, their lighter, which was a boat, I should say, about a mile. Pushed by the tide, yet the light vanished. The men realized their boat had returned to its original location. They had no memory of rowing against the tide or dropping anchor. They theorized that the light somehow transported them back to where they started. There are many theories surrounding what the Puritans actually saw that night. The most common theory states that the light was an ignis fatuus, which is a phenomenon that appears over marshland at nighttime, and it happens when gas from decomposed organic matter combusts in the air. However, if Winthrop's account is accurate, then the light shot back and forth across the sky rather than rose from the marsh below. So we may never know exactly what the Puritans saw that night. However, I am personally siding with the fact that it was most likely ignited swamp gas. Although that still cannot explain how the men came back to their original location, even though they did not remember rowing back to it. CBS, please don't copyright strike me. UFOs would not gain mass media attention, however, until some 2 centuries later. And it happened, and quite frankly, I think this actually kind of makes sense, in Northern California. The year was 1896. The entire region was excited and united by one thing: a mysterious aircraft that was spotted repeatedly in the skies over the cities of San Francisco, Oakland, and Sacramento. Now, airships had been invented, but they were flown mostly in Europe and did not make a West Coast debut yet. Making these sightings even more strange was the fact that they happened only at night, and the aircraft allegedly had wings, which was unlike any airship that existed at the time, because at this time they were still mostly using hot air balloons, and if you want more insight on that, go back and listen to my episode on the history of aircraft in the United States. And multiple passengers on an Oakland streetcar one night in November described the craft hovering over Fruitvale, which is a neighborhood in Oakland, as, and I quote, resembling a huge bird in its outlines, which seemed to rise and fall in its course. That same night, the conductor of the streetcar said the ship had one powerful headlight and several smaller lights on board. This elaboration was welcome, as many witnesses around the Bay Area had reported seeing only bright lights in the sky. The day after the sighting on the streetcar, the San Francisco Call and Post reported the airship was high in the heavens and appeared to be of huge size. When first seen, it seemed to be floating over San Leandro. It moved rapidly, going at least 20 miles an hour. It shot across the skies in the northwest, then turned quickly and disappeared in the direction of Hayward. Now, I know some of you out there thinking, oh, these just must have been a bunch of country bumpkins who were seeing this. Oh, no. Several very prominent men had reported seeing the airship. One such man was the advertising manager of the San Francisco Call and Post, Samuel Fultz, who had seen the craft in San Francisco. And Colonel W.H. Minton of the Southern Pacific Railroad Company saw the airship from the Supreme Court building at Larkin and McAllister. The light was far brighter than any of the electric lights I saw just below, in, and about the park, he would later tell the Call. No inventor of the aircraft ever came forward, and no winged airship was ever patented and produced. And actually, the first gas-powered Zeppelin didn't even fly until 1900, and even then, its voyage was in Germany, and airships weren't even used by the U.S. Army until 1908. And during this time, we also see the early years of alien abduction cases. Again, in California in 1896, a man named Colonel H.G. Shaw was en route to Stockton, California on November 25, 1896. Suddenly, something appeared and spooked the horses. Looking out of the carriage to see what was causing the ruckus, Colonel Shaw saw to his amazement strange beings standing at the side of the road. 3 very tall humanoid creatures stood before them. Standing about 7 feet tall, they were noted to be bald, with a soft brown down like feathers covering their bodies. He described them as having small hands at the end of very long, thin arms. Their large eyes dwarfed the size of their mouths, and later both men would describe the beings as being strangely beautiful. I don't know where they would have gotten that from. Doesn't really sound very beautiful to me. And as daylight was fading, the beings carried small lamps that shone unnaturally bright. They had what appeared to be a bag and some sort of breathing apparatus, and the glow from their lights illuminated the spaceship which was above them in the sky. The beings communicated with an unusual type of chant. Colonel Shaw would later tell the authorities that the beings attempted to abduct them, but found the mass of the men too heavy. Colonel Shaw and his companion followed the beings as they walked away towards a nearby bridge. The cigar-shaped ship, which is very often how UFOs are described, was hovering just above. The men described the beings as gliding rather than walking as they moved. Unusually, they entered the craft by a sort of springing step upward towards the sky, which took them above it, and they effortlessly glided into the ship. Perhaps this was the same aircraft which, a year later, would crash in Texas. On April 17, 1897, an airship crashed into a man named Jug Proctor's windmill in the town of Aurora, Texas, and burst into flames. Among the wreckage, Aurora residents found the disfigured remains of the airship's pilot. The alien is now called Ned and was given a proper Christian burial in the local Aurora Cemetery. A newspaper article of the event still exists, written by S.E. Hayden, a reporter for the newspaper. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing across the country. It was traveling due north and much nearer than the Earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour, and gradually settling toward the Earth. It sailed over a public square and went And when it reached the north part of town, it collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went into pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and a water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one aboard, and while his remains were badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show he was not an inhabitant of this world. Alien spacecraft would not make a reappearance, at least ones that's well documented, until some 51 years later, and this time they really made an impact in American culture. The first well-known UFO sighting occurred in 1947 when a businessman named Kenneth Arnold claimed to see a group of 9 high-speed objects near Mount Rainier in Washington while flying his small plane. And Arnold estimated the speed of the crescent-shaped objects as several thousand miles per hour and said they moved like saucers skipping on water, and hence the term flying saucer. And it was around this time that another group of people who would forever be associated with UFOs and UFO sightings would come full force. And that, of course, is the Men in Black. That's right, the movie may be based on fact. Many people who claim to have seen UFOs have also claimed that they were intimidated by men wearing dark suits to stay quiet. The first occurrence of this happened again in 1947 when a man named Harold Dahl was on a conservation mission on Puget Sound, Washington, near the eastern shore of Washington's Maury Island, gathering logs when he saw 6 what he described as donut-shaped obstacles hovering above about half a mile above his boat. Before long, one of them fell nearly 1,500 feet, followed by raining metallic debris, some of which hit Dahl's son Charles on the arm, as well as the family dog, who did not survive it. Dahl was able to take some pictures of the aircraft with his camera, which later he showed to his supervisor, Fred Chrisman. The skeptical Chrisman went back to the scene to look for himself and saw such an aircraft with his own eyes. The next morning, Dahl was visited by a man wearing a black suit. They ended up at a local diner where the man was able to recount in extraordinary detail what Dahl had just witnessed. What I have said is proof to you that I know a great deal more about this experience of yours than you will want to believe, the man said. Dahl was also told not to speak of the incident, and if he did, bad things would happen. Also in 1947 was one of the most famous UFO crashes in U.S. history, and that, of course, is the incident in Roswell, New Mexico. It happened when a local rancher named W.W. Brazel came across a mysterious 200-yard-long wreckage near an Army airfield in Roswell, New Mexico. Local papers said that it was the remains of a flying saucer. The U.S. military, however, issued a statement that it was just a weather balloon. The flames of conspiracy were further fanned in the 1950s when dummies with latex skin and aluminum bones that looked suspiciously like aliens fell from the sky across New Mexico and were hurriedly picked up by military vehicles. Some who believed in the earlier Roswell sightings thought that this seemed like a government cover-up. For the Air Force, these dummy drops were just a way to test new ways for pilots to survive falls. And so sightings of UFOs increased, and in 1948, the U.S. Air Force began an investigation of these reports called Project Sign. Cold War tension was beginning to mount, and the initial opinion of those involved with the project was that UFOs were most likely sophisticated Soviet aircraft, although some researchers suggested that they might be spacecraft from other worlds, and this led to the so-called extraterrestrial hypothesis, or ETH for short. Within a year, Project Sign was succeeded by Project Grudge, which, in 1952, was itself replaced by the longest-lived of the official inquiries into UFOs, which is Project Blue Book, which was headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And from 1952 to 1969, Project Blue Book compiled reports of more than 12,000 UFO sightings or events, each of which was ultimately classified as identified with a known astronomical, atmospheric, or human-caused phenomenon, or unidentified. The latter group, approximately 6% of the total, included cases for which there was insufficient information to make an identification with a known phenomenon. And in 1952, a series of radar and visual sightings occurred near the National Airport in Washington, D.C., and although these events were attributed to temperature inversions in the air over the city, not everyone was convinced by the explanation. And this led and this led to the CIA prompting the U.S. government to establish an expert panel of scientists to investigate the occurrences. The panel was headed by H.P. Robertson, who was a physicist from the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, and included other physicists, an astronomer, and a rocket engineer. The Robertson panel met for 3 days in 1953 and interviewed military officers and the head of Project Blue Book. They also reviewed films and photographs of UFOs. Their conclusions were that 1. 90% of the sightings could easily be attributed to astronomical and meteorological phenomenon. 2. There was no obvious security threat. And 3. There was no evidence to support the ETH. Parts of the panel's report were kept classified until 1979, and this long period of secrecy helped fuel suspicions of a government cover-up. The second committee was set up in 1966 at the request of the Air Force to review the most interesting material gathered by Project Blue Book. 2 years later, this committee released its results at a scientific study of identified flying objects called the Condon Report, named for Edward U. Condon, the physicist who headed the investigation. The Condon Report was reviewed by a special committee of the National Academy of Sciences. A total of 37 scientists all wrote chapters or parts of chapters for the report, which covered investigations of the 59 UFO sightings in total. And now this also gives me a chance to discuss some of the possible causes for UFO sightings. Now, UFO reports have varied widely in reliability, as judged by the number of witnesses, whether the witnesses were independent of each other, the observing of conditions, and the direction of the sighting. Typically, witnesses who take the trouble to report a sighting consider the object to be of extraterrestrial origin, or maybe a military craft, but certainly under intelligent control. Now, the untrained eye can be tricked. A bright light, such as the planet Venus, often appears to move. Planets can also be alarming to drivers as they seem to follow the car. And visual impressions of distance and speed of UFOs are highly unreliable because they are based on an assumed size and are often made against a blank sky with no background objects to set a maximum distance. Reflections from windows and eyeglasses can produce superimposed views, and complex optical systems such as camera lenses can turn point sources of light into apparently saucer-shaped phenomenon, and I have actually seen something like this before in some pictures. Such optical illusions and the psychological desire to interpret images are known to explain many visual UFO reports, and at least some sightings are known to be hoaxes. Radar sightings, while in certain respects are more reliable, fail to discriminate between artificial objects and meteor trails, ionized gas, rain, or thermal disturbances in the atmosphere. And as for events such as abductions, some psychologists believe that this may be sleep paralysis, as this causes sleepers to experience temporary mobility and a belief they are being watched. And well, folks, it looks as if I'm going to have to wrap up this rather unusual episode of Bowtie Talks, and I think we've learned that sometimes the unexplainable does need to be explained. And it's good to know that not all UFO sightings hold water. In some cases, it may just be planets. In some cases, it might just be a flare on a camera lens. So there you have it. And so the next time anyone claims to have seen an alien aircraft, ask them if they were wearing eyeglasses at the time. And so there you have it. So goodbye, God bless, and remember to watch the skies.